The cowboy watched a hungry widow feed her kids leftovers. Then he whispered, "Not anymore. You're coming with me." The first snow always came quiet to Wyoming, like it was ashamed to fall on people already half broken. The wind that morning didn't howl, it whispered, thin and sharp, cutting through the gaps in the clapboard walls of a one-room shack at the edge of the Tumble Hollow Creek. Inside, a widow sat on her knees, stirring the last of the stew. 3 kids huddled around the stove, eyes bright and hollow all at once. "Don't eat too fast," she murmured, voice barely a thread. The ladle scraped the bottom of the pot. 1 potato chunk, 2 spoons of broth, and a miracle's worth of nothing left. She filled their bowls unevenly, pretending it was on purpose. "Mama, you don't got any?" the youngest asked. His lips cracked from cold. She smiled, the kind of smile that knew how to lie for love. "Mama's full, baby." It wasn't true. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. But a mother's hunger is the one the world doesn't hear. The wind pushed through the cracks again. The boards groaned like they wanted to collapse just to rest. Her name was Abigail Moore, 28, widow to a man who never came home from the war 2 winters back. He left with a borrowed rifle and came back under a blanket with no face to kiss goodbye. Since then, she'd been surviving on leftover hope, mending clothes for pennies, trading bread for coal. Tonight, even the bread was gone. When the kids finished eating, she waited till they fell asleep under the thin quilt, then scraped what crumbs were left into her hand and pressed them to her lips. Cold bread, hard, tasteless. But she chewed slow, eyes fixed on the small window where the snow had started again. Outside, past the fence line, a dark figure on horseback had been sitting still for near an hour. He watched her light flicker and fade, and when the cabin went dark, he finally breathed. He was called Cole Redding, though few used the name. Most just called him the Quiet, a rancher without a herd, a man without a laugh. Folks said he once had both, before the fever took his wife and the unborn son she carried. Since then, he didn't talk much. He rode the trails, fixed fences for neighbors, and avoided the sound of music like it might break him open. That night, he'd been riding toward town when the wind shifted and carried the smell of smoke, faint, thin, but real. Not wood smoke. Stove smoke. A house trying to stay alive. He followed it. And that's how he found her, through the frost-clouded window, feeding 3 small mouths while pretending not to starve. He didn't move closer. He didn't knock. He just sat there, watching the kind of pain he recognized like a mirror. When she blew out the lamp, he whispered into the cold, "Not anymore." The horse's breath puffed white in the dark. Cole turned back toward his ranch, but something in his chest wouldn't quiet. He had money, food, space, and he had no one. That was the cruelest kind of wealth. By dawn, when the frost painted the world bone white, he was already back on the trail. Toward her. Inside the cabin, Abigail woke to a sound that made her heart lurch. Hooves. Steady, slow, coming closer. She froze, eyes darting to the door. "Stay in bed," she whispered to the kids, her breath fogging in the air. The knock came heavy, deliberate. She gripped the kitchen knife by instinct. "Who's there?" A pause. Then a voice, deep and quiet. "Name's Redding. I ain't here to harm you." She hesitated. The world hadn't been kind to widows, and strange men never came with kindness. "What do you want?" Another pause. The kind where truth gathered courage. "Want to make sure you don't starve." Something inside her twisted. "We're fine." The lie burned her throat worse than the cold. The latch creaked as he pushed the door open a little, not stepping in, just enough for her to see the bundle in his arms. A sack of flour, a smoked ham, 2 jars of molasses. Her eyes stung, not from gratitude, from shame. She wanted to scream that she didn't need saving, that she wasn't some charity case in a man's story. But behind her, one of her children coughed in his sleep. The dry, weak kind of cough that scares a mother more than thunder. She lowered the knife. He stepped inside quietly, snow melting off his hat. He set the sack on the table, then pulled off his gloves and nodded toward the stove. "You'll need more wood." "Got some in the wagon." She finally found her voice, low, bitter, trembling. "Why?" He looked at her then, eyes gray as the winter sky. "Because nobody should have to watch their kids eat scraps." She opened her mouth to protest, but he turned toward the door again, saying just one thing, a whisper that hung in the air like a vow. "Not anymore. You're coming with me." She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to tell him to leave his sacks of food on the porch, mount his horse, and ride back to the life he'd been cobbling together alone. She wanted to close the door and keep the shame to herself, to let the kids keep sleeping with the quilts over their heads and the stove nearly cold. Pride is an old coin that jingles louder when a woman's pockets are empty. But how do you teach a child to sleep when their belly grumbles like a trapped thing? How do you explain a man with a sack of flour who says, "Not anymore"? Abigail pulled the blanket up to her chin and thought about the ledger of indignities that had collected since the funeral. The neighbors who looked away, the landlord who'd tapped his pen and tightened the price of the rent, the boys who'd asked where her husband was as if he'd simply misplaced himself. She thought of the way winter made the world small and sharp and impossible to hide from. She thought of the youngest's cough and the bruise on the older boy's knuckle from yesterday's scuffle over a crust. Outside, the wind began to push harder, making the eaves creak like a ship in a storm. Cole stood on the porch with his hat tipped, hands tucked into the pockets of his duster. He didn't step closer while she gathered her dignity. He waited like someone who had learned to wait, because nothing hurried his kind of heart. "Come on," he said when she finally opened the door. His voice did not press. It merely offered. "I ain't asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to keep your children warm." She laughed once then, a sound small as a coin flip. "And what, Mr. Redding, do you expect me to do? Sit at your table and be grateful? Let my children call some stranger Papa? You don't have to call me anything." He looked at the children through the doorway, not at her. "Just come. For a spell. Winter eats folks quieter than a rifle. I've got a small room, a stove that will see you through, and work enough to keep you from going hollow." That's all words simple enough to swallow. But she'd taken pride into every hinge of that cabin, and letting it go felt like letting the past climb in beside her and set up housekeeping. "Why?" she pressed. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me." He did not answer right away. He closed the door with a soft push, the lock clicking with a sound that felt heavy and real. "Because I know what it is to wake up and feel the bed cold," he said finally. "I know what it is to have the house full of things that don't mean anything without a voice to say your name. I got no right to be your judge. I got a horse and a roof. That's nearer useful than a sermon." She looked at him then, at the way his jaw clenched like he was biting back weather. There was something older than charity in his offer, something that smelled of war and loss and long winters of keeping promises to a photograph on a mantel. She thought of the photograph pinned above their stove, her husband in better days, grin crooked, hat tilted, and how many times she had carried that grin like a small talisman through hunger. "Give me a day," she said at last. "I'll see if I can gather a few things. I don't much trust leaving. Folks in towns take what they're given." Cole nodded. "Day's plenty." He shouldered the sacks back into the wagon and offered a hand to the older boy. The boy's stare was a map of mistrust, but he took it like a small treaty. The other two clung together, drowsy and thin. They left before the dawn broke hard, a lantern hooked to the wagon's side, smoke from the stove still trailing thin as a memory. Abigail wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders and for the first time in months walked without counting the steps that would lead her back to despair. The children shuffled beside her, boot soles whispering soft against the snow. The world opened wide and white and indifferent. Tracks faded quickly, swallowed by the new snowfall. Abigail's mother had once told her that snow remembers. It remembers what's walked over it and keeps it close until spring wants to forgive. She wondered if the land might forgive them too. Cole drove steady. He spoke little, and when he did it was to point out a safe rut or how the wind bent the saplings. The silence between them wasn't empty. It carried the sort of language spoken in firesides where men and women build houses and names out of very little. He told her once about a son he'd lost before the boy's name ever had a chance to hold the weight of being alive. Abigail told him, careless, as if she'd been storing the words for too long, about the night she'd wrapped her husband's boots and shoved the warm hand into the grave. "Did you ever feel like the world is just a ledger?" she asked, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Like something keeps tally of all the wrongs and never stops?" Cole's horse snorted. He watched the road. "Sometimes," he said. "But then you find people who need more than a ledger, Abby. You find folks you can owe something to that don't make you bitter." Abby looked at the way he said her name. It fit strangely in the wind, like a small hand in a bigger one. She had not heard it in a while. Abby. It was softer than Abigail, kinder somehow. The first night at Cole's ranch, a place called Black Hollow, a handful of buildings stacked against the wind with a stubbornness Abigail admired, was less like entering a stranger's home and more like returning to a house that had been waiting for someone to come back. The children slept in a heated room that smelled of cedar and coal, the elder boy's cough easing under the fold of a good blanket. Cole showed Abigail where she'd sleep, a cot near the stove. He showed her the pantry, the ration jars and salted meats lined like soldiers. He also showed her the ledger, a crude book where Cole kept names of work done, food given, favors traded. On the top line of the newest page, he'd written simply, "Abigail Moore, family, keep safe." "You don't owe me nothing," he said, noticing her eye on the page. "Work when you can. Take what's needed when it's needed. You keep your pride, I keep my word." Was that enough to steady a heart that had been skittish for so long? Not yet. But her children ate that night without counting crumbs. They woke to warm porridge and the feel of wool against their skin, and for the first time in months, they laughed. A small, brittle sound, but a sound nonetheless. Outside, the wind tried and failed at the windows, but the stove kept its steady hum. Cole sat in a chair opposite the stove, hat in his lap, the silhouette of a man who had given himself to the cold and returned with less bitterness than such things deserved. They had not promised love, or marriage, or an easy life. They simply shared the space like two weary travelers who had finally found a rest spot long enough to dry their socks. That night, as Abigail tended to the children, she thought of the ledger and the way Cole had written her name. It was a small, strange baptism. Tomorrow would bring work and the suspicion of neighbors and a town full of opinions. But for the next few hours, the children slept warm, and a man named Cole Redding kept his watch like the slow turning of a sentinel. And when the wind outside eased into something like a lullaby, Abigail let herself think, just once, about the possibility that winter could be kept from devouring them. Not by miracles, not by sermons, but by the slow, stubborn act of one man bringing bread to a woman who had run out of recipes for survival. She fell asleep with the ledger's ink burned behind her eyes. She woke with the sound of Cole's voice, still low, still the same promise as the first night, not anymore. But were promises enough to fix a life that had been broken? Or did you need something harder? Work, stubbornness, the willingness to be seen in the places you'd hidden? She would find out soon. Snow came early that year, thick and jealous. It covered fences, buried paths, and silenced the world until even the birds forgot their songs. But inside Black Hollow, the old stove kept humming like a heart that refused to quit. Abigail woke before dawn every morning, the air still sharp enough to make her lungs sting. She'd slip from her cot, stir the embers, and coax the fire back to life with slow patience, the same patience it took to raise children on hope instead of bread. The cabin would fill with that orange living light, and she'd watch her children's faces soften in the warmth. That alone was worth every frostbitten morning. Cole was always up before her. Sometimes she'd find him outside, hat low, splitting logs with the kind of focus that came from trying not to think. Other times he'd already be riding the ridge line, checking on the few head of cattle that had survived the early blizzard. He never spoke much, but what he did say, he meant. Winds shifting east, he'd murmur while pouring his coffee, means more snow before Sunday. Abigail would nod, hands busy with the kettle, heart busy with thoughts she didn't dare speak. The house was quiet, but not empty. By the third week, the kids had started to laugh again. The youngest, Maggie, followed Cole everywhere, her little boots leaving uneven prints beside his in the snow. He never told her to stop. He'd just look down, faint amusement flickering in those gray eyes. When she slipped, he'd scoop her up with one arm and say, "Steady now. You walk like a calf on new legs." Maggie would giggle, cheeks pink, and Abigail would watch from the window, her chest tight with something she hadn't felt in years. Safety, maybe, or the ache that comes before gratitude. Still, she couldn't shake the guilt. Every time she stirred stew from his stores or patched her boy's pants with thread from his drawer, it scraped at her pride. She'd been raised to earn her keep, not borrow it. So one night, after the kids were asleep, she found him out by the barn sharpening a hatchet under the lantern light. "I'm not staying for free," she said softly. Her voice carried the tremor of someone afraid of her own words. He didn't look up. "You're not." "I mean it, Cole. I can sew, mend, cook. You need help, not charity." The hatchet paused mid-turn. He lifted his eyes to hers, calm, unreadable. "You think keeping those kids alive through a Wyoming winter's not work?" he said. She hesitated. "They're my children. My burden." He wiped his hands on his coat, the sound of leather brushing against rough wool filling the quiet. "They're your reason," he corrected. "That's different from a burden." The words hit harder than any sermon. Christmas came quiet that year. The nearest town was 10 miles east, and the roads were buried. There was no church service, no market, no tree, just a few candles, a stew pot, and the kind of laughter that sounded like defiance. Cole brought in a branch from the frozen pines and set it in a bucket by the stove. "Closest thing to a tree you'll get," he said. The children decorated it with buttons and string, and Maggie found an old horseshoe out by the shed that she insisted was for luck. Abigail hadn't laughed that freely since before the telegram came, the one that told her the war had taken everything but her name. Later that night, when the kids were asleep, she found herself at the window again. The moonlight spilled across the snow like spilled milk. She turned, found him sitting near the stove, the glow painting his face in amber and shadow. "You ever wonder," she whispered, "if the world means to test us or just forget us?" He didn't answer right away. He took his time, as if searching for words that wouldn't lie. "Don't know about tests," he said finally, "but I reckon the world forgets plenty. God don't." She looked down. Feels like he did. He met her eyes then, steady, unflinching. Then maybe I remembered for him. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like two people standing at the edge of something neither dared name. January came harder. The snow thickened into walls. The cattle yard froze solid. And then came the fever. It started with Maggie. A cough, then heat, then stillness that scared the breath out of her mother. By the second night, both boys were sick too. Abigail didn't sleep. She sat by the bed, sponging foreheads with melted snow, praying until her voice cracked. Cole stayed close but quiet, chopping wood through the night, fetching water, keeping the fire alive. Every time she faltered, his shadow filled the doorway, steady as an oak tree. On the third night, when Maggie's breathing turned ragged, Abigail broke. She sank to her knees beside the stove, hands pressed to her face, whispering through tears, "I can't lose them. I can't do it again. Please, please." Cole knelt beside her, slow, careful. He didn't speak right away. He just reached out and laid his rough hand over hers. Warm, heavy, sure. "You won't," he said simply. But she could see the fear in his eyes too, because he'd lost before. And love doesn't make a man fearless. It makes him fragile in new ways. That night, he saddled his horse and rode into the storm. Abigail watched through the window, heart pounding, as his figure disappeared into the white. He was gone nearly 6 hours. When the door burst open again before dawn, snow covered his coat to the shoulders. He was half frozen, bleeding from a branch cut across his cheek, but in his hands he held a small wooden box and 3 bottles of medicine. "Doctor in town owed me a favor," he said, voice hoarse. He didn't wait for her to speak. He just knelt beside Maggie's bed, opened the bottles with hands that shook, and helped her drink. By morning, the fever broke. When Abigail saw her daughter's chest rise and fall steady again, she pressed her forehead to Cole's shoulder and wept without shame. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her cry into his coat until the light came. Winter began to soften after that, not outside, but inside them. Every day carried the quiet rhythm of survival, wood stacked, soup stirred, chores done without words. But sometimes, in the middle of those small moments, their eyes would meet, and something wordless would pass between them. Something that had nothing to do with charity, and everything to do with 2 lives learning how to trust again. One night, as the wind howled beyond the walls, Abigail said softly, "I don't know what we are anymore." Cole looked at her for a long time, then answered, "We're what's left. And sometimes, that's enough to build from." She didn't argue. She didn't need to, because deep down she already knew the world might never give back what they'd lost. But maybe, just maybe, it had given them what they needed to start again. And as the snow kept falling over Black Hollow, neither of them noticed how quietly it began to look like home. The snow didn't melt all at once. It softened in patches, like the land was learning how to breathe again. Drifts turned to trickles, trickles to mud, and the fields around Black Hollow woke up slow, scarred, but alive. Abigail felt the same way. She'd started humming again when she worked, low and tuneless, but alive. The children, now rosy and well-fed, chased each other across the yard, while the air filled with the smell of thawing pine and manure. And Cole, still the quiet keeper of their fragile peace, spent his days mending fences and his nights sharpening tools in the amber glow of the lamp. If winter had been their cage, spring was the hinge creaking open. But freedom, she soon learned, doesn't come without ghosts. The first sign came in the form of hoofbeats, not Cole's steady rhythm, heavier, faster, meaner. It was nearly sundown when they arrived, 3 men on horses, mud-caked and loud in a way only desperate men are. Abigail saw them from the kitchen window and froze. Cole stepped out before they could dismount. His hat was low, his hand easy near the revolver at his hip. The tallest of the men swung off his horse with a smirk. "You Cole Redding?" "Depends who's asking. Name's Ford Milner. We rode through town, heard you took in a widow." Abigail Moore Abigail's name hit the air like a bullet. Her breath caught. Ford spat into the dirt. "Her husband owed me $50 before the war. Man died without paying. Law says the debt's the wife's now. I'll be collecting." Cole's voice didn't rise. "She don't owe you a thing." The man laughed. "She's under your roof, huh?" "I see how it is." He looked past Cole, right toward the doorway where Abigail stood, pale and still. "Ain't that sweet? Widow feeding her young ones with another man's coin." Before Abigail could speak, Cole's hand moved. Not fast, slow enough to mean control, not threat. He stepped forward, his shadow long against the ground. "You've had your say. Now you'll turn that horse around and ride out." Ford grinned wider. "Or what? You'll shoot me over some charity case?" "Don't think so." Abigail's pulse roared in her ears. She could see the moment tightening, like frost about to crack underfoot. She stepped out then, trembling but steady. "I'll pay you." Her voice startled even her. "Give me time. I'll find a way." Ford sneered. "Time's run out, darling." And then, before she could blink, Cole stepped between them. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was lower than a prayer and sharper than the wind. "You heard me the first time. You're done here." The quiet that followed was heavy as stone. Ford's smirk faltered. His companions shifted in their saddles. Something in Cole's eyes, something old, hard-earned, and absolute, made the air colder than the snow ever had. When Ford finally spoke, his bravado cracked. "Ain't worth the trouble. He spat once more, turned and mounted. The others followed. They rode off toward the horizon, curses trailing faint in the wind. Abigail stood frozen long after they disappeared. Her body shook, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. The knowledge that this man had risked blood and law for her, without ever asking what she was to him. "Why'd you do that?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "You don't even know if he was telling the truth." Cole wiped his hands on his coat, eyes still on the fading dust. "I don't need to know," he said. "I saw your face. That's truth enough." She looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she whispered, "You can't keep saving me." He turned toward her then, and for the first time in months, she saw anger. Quiet, honest anger. "I ain't saving you," he said. "I'm standing beside you. Difference matters." That night, after the children were asleep, Abigail stepped outside. The moon hung low, the world silver and wet with thaw. She found him leaning against the fence, cigarette ember glowing faint in the dark. She walked up beside him, coat pulled tight, eyes down on the mud. "I used to think being alone was strength," she said. "I used to tell myself I didn't need anyone, that needing was the same as begging." He didn't reply. He waited, the way he always did. But tonight, when those men came, she swallowed hard. "I realized I was scared. Not of them, but of losing this, you. The peace in that house. I can't go back to the noise and the hunger and pretending I don't care." Cole turned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Then don't." Her breath fogged between them. "You don't understand. A woman like me doesn't just start over. Folks remember. They whisper. Let 'em whisper," he said. "Wind carries noise, not truth." Something broke inside her then, something brittle and long withheld. She took one step closer, then another, until the cold between them disappeared. He didn't reach for her, he just stood still, letting her decide. When she finally laid her head against his chest, he whispered the same words that had followed her since the night he knocked on her door. "Not anymore." The days after that were quieter, softer, but not simple. The children, innocent as dawn, started calling him Mr. Cole. Maggie would fall asleep on his lap by the fire, and he'd pretend it didn't make him smile. Abigail worked beside him now, mending fences, baking bread, learning how to laugh without guilt. But spring on the frontier is never just renewal. It's test. The river swelled with meltwater, flooding the lower fields. A horse broke its leg in the mud. Then fever came again, not to her home this time, but to the nearby town. Cole rode out to deliver medicine, same as he'd done for them months before. He was gone 2 days, then 3. By the 4th, worry took her whole body hostage. When she saw his horse staggering back through the dusk, rider slumped, hat gone, she ran. He'd caught fever himself. She dragged him off the saddle half dead, burning like fire under ice. The days that followed were a blur of wet cloths and whispered prayers. The children tiptoed, terrified. Abigail barely left his side. Every time he coughed, she flinched. Every time he stilled, she held his hand like the world was holding its breath. "You can't leave us now," she whispered one night, forehead pressed to his. "You said not anymore." And for the first time in days, his cracked lips twitched in something like a smile. He whispered, faint but clear, "I meant it." He didn't die. Winter had taken enough from both of them. By the time the fever broke, the fields outside were green again. The creek sang like something newly forgiven. When he opened his eyes, she was there, hollow-eyed, exhausted, but alive with relief. And in that look, neither of them needed to say what the world already knew. They were each other's unfinished prayers, answered too late, but answered nonetheless. When summer finally came to Black Hollow, it didn't come with fireworks or music. It came with slow warmth. Like a shy guest stepping through a doorway, she wasn't sure she was welcome in. The grass grew in uneven patches. The creek sang louder. And for the first time since God had taken everything from her, Abigail woke to the sound of laughter instead of wind. The kind of laughter that came from children who were full and safe and unafraid. Cole healed slow, but steady. The fever had stripped him to bone and shadow, but his will, that quiet, immovable thing that had carried him through every empty year before her, never broke. He walked again before July. By August, he was back in the saddle, the children trailing behind him like ducklings, Maggie calling out, "Faster, Mr. Cole, faster!" He'd smile, that half-smile, rare, crooked, like he wasn't used to the muscles that made it. "Horse don't run on air, little one," he'd mutter. But every time, he gave in and nudged the reins, and the yard would fill with the thunder of small, joyous feet. Abigail would stand on the porch, arms crossed, pretending to scold, but her eyes would betray her, soft, bright, and alive again. Every now and then she'd catch him looking at her, too long, too tenderly, like a man trying to memorize a sunrise before it disappeared. One evening, when the sky bled gold and lavender, Cole came up the porch steps with a quiet weight in his step. He held something wrapped in burlap. "Found this in town," he said, unwrapping it. Inside was a wooden box, plain, handmade. He opened it slow. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, worn, yellowed, edges singed. Abigail frowned. "What is it?" He handed it to her. "It's your husband's debt note. Ford Milner had it. Sold it off to settle his own dues after he ran off south." Her hands trembled as she held it. The paper that had kept her in fear, the reason she'd stayed quiet when men spat her name like a curse. Cole struck a match, lit the corner of the note, and held it till the flame took. Abigail gasped. "You shouldn't—" He dropped it in the dirt and watched it burn to nothing. "Now you don't owe nobody," he said. "Not a cent, not a soul." Her throat tightened. "Cole?" He shook his head, voice low. "You don't gotta say it. I just wanted you to see what gone looks like." That night, after the children fell asleep, she found him sitting out by the fence, staring into the dark like he was listening to the land breathe. She sat beside him, quiet. For a while, neither spoke. "You ever think," she whispered finally, "that maybe this, all of it, was meant to happen? That maybe we had to lose everything to find what was left?" He tilted his head, thinking. "I used to think life was just what got left behind after the world took its fill," he said. "But now I reckon it's what you build after, what you decide to keep." She looked at him, really looked at him. The lines that time and loneliness had carved deep, the scar along his jaw, the eyes that never flinched from hers. Her voice came soft. "And what is it you're keeping now, Cole Redding?" He turned to her. The dusk painted him in gold and smoke. "You," he said simply. It wasn't a confession. It was a fact. Weeks passed, quiet and full. The world outside didn't stop being cruel, but inside their small corner, there was peace. Abigail began teaching the children their letters by lamplight. Cole carved them wooden toys from old pine stumps. He even laughed sometimes, really laughed, not the cautious kind he used to fake. But peace, like any living thing, demands courage to keep. One afternoon, while hanging laundry under the wide blue sky, Abigail heard a wagon approach. Dust rose from the trail. 2 men, 1 horse-drawn cart, and a deputy's badge glinting in the light. Cole was at the barn before she could call his name. The older man tipped his hat. "Cole Redding?" Sheriff Amos Cole nodded. "Afternoon, Sheriff. What's the trouble?" The man motioned to the wagon. "You took in a widow some months back, Abigail Moore. She's wanted for questioning. Her husband's kin showed up in town with papers. Claims she ran off with money he was owed." Abigail froze in the doorway. Her heart dropped straight through her chest. "They're lying," she said, stepping forward. "There was no money. He died owing more than we had." The sheriff shrugged, weary. "Maybe so, ma'am, but the law's got to ask its questions." Cole stepped in front of her. "You asking," he said slowly, "or accusing?" The sheriff sighed. "Just asking. But if she runs, I'll have to call it something else." The air went still. Abigail's fingers clutched the fabric of his coat. "I won't run," she whispered. Cole's voice dropped lower than thunder. "She doesn't have to go anywhere." Cole, she whispered, it's all right. If I go, maybe it ends. He turned to her, eyes dark with that quiet fire that never shouted but always meant war. No, he said, it ends here. You've run enough. The sheriff studied him a long time. Then, with a slow nod, he said, I didn't come to make enemies. You seem like decent folks. I'll tell the kin there's nothing here worth chasing. He tipped his hat again and turned the wagon back toward the road. Abigail watched until the dust settled, her knees weak, tears threatening. Cole exhaled, slow and deep. He won't be back, he said. And for the first time since the day she buried her husband, Abigail believed someone when they told her she was safe. That night, the sky over Black Hollow burned with stars. The air smelled like hay and new rain. The children were asleep, the house still. Abigail stood by the doorway, watching the man who had once been a stranger stack firewood beneath the porch. She walked over quietly, pressed her hands to his chest and whispered, I can't pay you back for what you've given me. He caught her wrists, held them gently. You already have. How? She breathed. He smiled then, not the quiet, sad kind, but a true breaking one. By staying. She leaned in, rested her forehead against his. You meant it, didn't you? She whispered. That night you said, not anymore. He nodded. I meant it then, and I mean it now. You're not alone anymore, Abby. You never will be. Years later, the town would whisper about them. The quiet cowboy who brought a widow home from the edge of hunger, and the woman who taught him how to live again. But the truth never made it into their stories. The truth was quieter, and far more sacred. It was in the way his hand always found hers when storms rolled in the way she'd hum the children to sleep while he mended saddles by the fire, in the laughter that filled the house where once there had been only wind. And sometimes, on cold mornings when the world turned white again, Abigail would remember that night in the shack, the smoke, the silence, the hunger. And she'd turn to the man beside her, place a hand on his cheek, and whisper the words that had once saved her. Not anymore. He'd smile, that slow, humble smile of a man who'd built something out of ruin, and kiss her forehead. And outside, the land that had watched them suffer now watched them live, not perfect, not rich, but whole. For in the heart of winter, a hungry widow fed her children the last of her hope, and a quiet cowboy decided that was enough reason to build a forever